The silence of the elite Aurelian room wasn't broken by a shout, but by the sickening, wet thud of a cleaning bucket hitting the floor. Cassia Vance, 7 months pregnant and draped in a faded blue cleaner's smock, was struggling to catch her breath. She wasn't just on the floor, she was pinned there by the weight of a humiliation she thought she'd escaped years ago. Above her stood Julian Vane, his face a mask of jagged, upper-class cruelty. He didn't just trip her. He had delivered a calculated, mocking kick to her hip that sent her spiraling into a heavy mahogany chair. "I told you the day I threw you out that you were a servant by blood, Cassia," Julian sneered, his voice carrying to every corner of the VIP section. He adjusted his silk tie, looking down at her like a stain he was waiting for someone else to scrub away. "Look at you. Pregnant, broke, and still cleaning up after men like me. Some things never change." Julian's new fiancée, draped in designer labels, didn't offer a hand. She didn't even look away from her phone. She simply adjusted her handbag and let out a soft, bored sigh. But as Cassia lay there, her hand clutched her stomach, shielding her 7-month-old son from the cold marble. On her other hand, hidden beneath a pair of yellow rubber gloves she had just ripped off, sat a massive, pear-cut diamond ring. Julian thought it was a cheap cubic zirconia. What he didn't know. What none of the high society diners recording the assault on their phones realized, was that the diamond was a custom-engineered transmitter. With a single, forceful press of the center stone, Cassia had just activated a level 1 extraction. 3 floors up, in a soundproof boardroom overlooking the city, Kwon Shin-woo felt his watch vibrate against his skin. He didn't blink. He didn't finish his sentence. He simply closed his laptop and stood up. The 5 most powerful bank directors in the country fell silent, terrified by the sudden, predatory shift in his eyes. The Aurelian room is a temple of excess, where the chandeliers cost more than a house and the floor is polished to a mirror finish. And there, surrounded by grey mop water and the fragments of a broken wine glass, Cassia Vance lay gasping. Her dark skin was a stark, regal contrast against the white stone, her hair disheveled from the fall. The crowd didn't intervene. This is the second lesson of the elite, performative indifference. Julian Vane wasn't just hurting a woman, he was asserting a hierarchy. He wanted the world to see that he could crush a nobody without consequence. "You should thank me, Cassia," Julian whispered, leaning down so only she could hear. "I'm teaching you the only lesson a woman like you needs, know your place." Julian believed he was the king of this mall. He was about to find out that the man who actually owned the land beneath his feet was currently in the elevator, and he wasn't coming down to negotiate. The ivory marble of the Aurelian room felt like ice against Cassia's skin, but the heat of the humiliation was far worse. She stayed down for a moment, her breath hitching, her fingers trembling as they dug into the thick fabric of her cleaning smock. Beside her, the grey mop water began to seep into the hem of Julian's pristine trousers. A slow-motion disaster he hadn't yet noticed. "Don't just sit there like an animal, Cassia. Clean it up," Julian sneered, his voice dropping to a low, jagged whisper that barely traveled past their table. "You always were a slow learner. That's why I replaced you with someone who actually knows how to carry a legacy, not just a bucket." His new fiancée, a woman whose face was a masterpiece of expensive plastic surgery, finally looked up from her screen. She didn't look horrified. She looked inconvenienced. "Julian, darling, don't waste your breath. The help never listens. Just call the manager and have her escorted out. She's ruining the aesthetic of the appetizers." Cassia finally found her footing, using the heavy mahogany chair she'd slammed into as a crutch. Her hip throbbed with a dull, rhythmic ache, a terrifying reminder of the force Julian had used. She really looked at him. And saw the hollow shell of a man who relied on a family crest to feel tall. She wasn't just a cleaner. For the last month, Cassia had been walking these halls undercover, a silent ghost in a blue uniform. As the secret co-owner of the Starfield Mall, she had traded her designer silk for this scratchy polyester to see the truth of how her staff was treated. She had wanted to be a fair leader, but she never expected her past to collide with her present in such a violent, public way. The aesthetic? Cassia's voice was a rasp, but it cut through the soft jazz playing overhead. She slowly reached for the wrist of her yellow rubber glove, the heavy material snapping against her skin as she peeled it back. You've spent so long looking down at people, Julian, you've forgotten to look at who actually owns the ground you're standing on. Julian laughed, a sharp, barking sound that drew the attention of the surrounding tables. I know exactly where I am. I'm in the most exclusive restaurant in the city, and you're the woman who's about to be fired from it. He reached out to grab her arm, his fingers closing tightly around her bicep to shove her toward the kitchen doors. But he stopped. His eyes fell on the hand she had just uncovered. There, catching the light of 1,000 crystal prisms, was a pear-cut diamond the size of a postage stamp. It wasn't just jewelry, it was a statement of absolute, crushing wealth. It was a ring that cost more than Julian's entire car collection. Where did a thief like you get that? Julian gasped, his grip tightening. Did you steal this from the lost and found? You're going to jail for this, Cassia. I'll make sure of it. I didn't steal it, Julian, Cassia said, her eyes locking onto his with a coldness that made him flinch. It was a wedding gift. Before he could process the words, she pressed the center stone. A faint, red pulse thrummed against her skin as the hidden transmitter began to hum. It was a frequency only a few devices in the city could pick up, and the most important one was currently 3 floors above. The shift in the room was instantaneous. The soft jazz died mid-note, replaced by a low-frequency vibration that rattled the silverware. At the entrance, the heavy oak doors didn't just close, they were locked by a centralized system that signaled a total security blackout. The elite diners, who seconds ago were laughing and filming Cassia's fall, now looked around with wide, frantic eyes as the steel shutters began their slow, rhythmic descent over the windows. Then, they heard the footsteps. They weren't the hurried steps of security guards. They were the slow, deliberate strikes of a man who had already won the war before arriving at the battlefield. Quan Xinwu entered the room like a shadow cast by a dying sun. He wore a charcoal black suit that seemed to absorb the ambient light, his presence so heavy it felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the atrium. Behind him, a phalanx of silent, stone-faced men moved into a perimeter, their eyes scanning the room with the efficiency of hunters. Julian let go of Cassia's arm, his arrogance finally flickering into a dim, primordial fear. He recognized the man approaching. Every person in the upper echelons of Seoul knew the face of the shadow dragon, though few were ever brave enough to look him in the eye. Xinwu ignored the gasps of the crowd. He ignored the cameras. He ignored Julian entirely. He walked straight to Cassia, his gaze softening only when it landed on her disheveled hair and the damp hem of her uniform. He knelt in the spilled water, his bespoke trousers soaking up the filth Julian had forced her into. With a hand that had ended empires, he gently cupped her cheek. I am here, Cassia, he whispered, his voice a low vibration that made the glass on the tables tremble. Did he touch you? Did he touch our son? Cassia leaned into his touch, the adrenaline finally giving way to a shaky breath. She glanced at Julian, who looked like a man watching his own execution. He thought I was still his housekeeper, she said softly. Xinwu stood up slowly, the tenderness in his face vanishing, replaced by a void of cold, calculating rage. He turned to face Julian, who had backed up so far he hit the very table he had been dining at. Julian Vane, Xinwu said, his voice dropping 10 degrees. You once told my wife she belonged on the floor. It seems only fair that you see what it looks like from down there. The air in the Aurelian room was thick with the scent of white truffles and the hushed tones of old money, a world Cassia had spent the last 7 months trying to understand from the ground up. She adjusted the strap of her apron, the weight of her pregnancy pulling at her lower back, and focused on the spill near table 12. To the diners, she was just a shadow in a blue uniform, a nameless gear in the machine of their luxury. She preferred it that way. In the quiet of her undercover work, she could breathe without the suffocating pressure of being a syndicate queen. But the peace shattered the moment the restaurant's heavy oak doors swung open, admitting a man whose very stride radiated unearned arrogance. Julian Vane didn't walk into a room, he invaded it. Cassia froze, her heart hammering against her ribs like a trapped bird. She kept her head down, her ponytail shielding her face, but she knew that voice. It was the voice that had told her she was disposable 2 years ago. It was the voice that had mocked her dreams while she scrubbed his penthouse floors. Is this the best Seoul has to offer? Julian's voice boomed, dripping with a condescending charm that made the head waiter bow deeper. He pulled out a chair for his fiancée, a woman who looked at the restaurant staff as if they were part of the furniture. I suppose it'll do for a light lunch. Cassia tried to retreat toward the kitchen, her bucket clutched tightly in her hand, but Julian's eyes, sharp, cold, and predatory, snagged on her silhouette. Wait, he called out, his tone shifting from bored to amused. That walk. That defensive little hunch of the shoulders. It can't be. Cassia stopped. She felt the eyes of the entire VIP section turn toward her. The bystander apathy was already setting in, the diners sensed a show, and they were eager for the entertainment. Julian stood up, walking toward her with a slow, theatrical pace. He circled her once, his nose wrinkled as if he'd caught the scent of something foul. Cassia Vance? My God, the rumors were true. You really did fall off the face of the earth after I fired you. Cassia finally looked up, her gaze steady despite the tremor in her hands. I wasn't fired, Julian. I quit. And I didn't fall, I moved on. Moved on to what? Scrubbing floors in a mall? Julian laughed, a sharp, ugly sound that made his fiancée giggle behind a manicured hand. He gestured to her swollen stomach with a flick of his wrist. And look at you. Knocked up and destitute. I told you that without my family's name, you were nothing more than a glorified servant. It seems you've finally accepted your destiny. My life is none of your business, Mr. Vane, Cassia said, her voice dropping to a dangerous, low hum. I suggest you sit down and enjoy your meal. The staff here doesn't get paid to listen to your delusions. The room went cold. No one spoke to Julian Vane that way. Julian's smirk didn't vanish, it sharpened. He stepped into her personal space, the expensive scent of his cologne clashing with the lemon-scented floor cleaner. You always did have too much spirit for a girl with so little value. You think because you're carrying a child, people will pity you? In this room, Cassia, you're just the help. And the help doesn't talk back to the guests. He reached out, his hand hovering near her shoulder as if to shove her aside, but he paused, noticing the way she instinctively moved to protect her belly. A cruel, enlightened light sparked in his eyes. He realized he had total power here. He was the guest, the donor, the elite. She was the woman who used to wash his socks. You know, Julian whispered, loud enough for the nearest tables to hear, I almost felt sorry for you. But seeing you like this? It's poetic justice. You thought you were too good for my house, so now you're cleaning everyone else's. He turned to the crowd, spreading his arms wide like an actor taking a bow. Ladies and gentlemen, a toast to the world's most ambitious housekeeper. From my bedroom to the mop bucket. Truly, a success story for the ages. Cassia felt the sting of tears, but she refused to let them fall. She reached for the silver clasp ring hidden beneath her glove, her thumb hovering over the diamond. She wasn't a housekeeper anymore. She was a wife. She was a mother. And Julian Vane was about to realize he was standing in a room owned by the very woman he was trying to bury. The air in the Aurelian room turned from cold to suffocating. Julian Vane wasn't finished with his performance. He flourished $100 bill, snapping the crisp paper between his fingers before letting it flutter toward the gray, soapy water at Cassia's feet. "Pick it up, Cassia," Julian commanded, his voice loud enough to silence the nearby diners. "It's more than you'd make in a week of scrubbing toilets. Consider it a tip for the entertainment." Cassia didn't move. She stood her ground, her hand protective over the 7-month curve of her belly. "Keep your money, Julian. You're going to need it for the legal fees when I have you removed for harassment." The crowd gasped. The bystander apathy that the narrator often warned about was in full effect. Instead of stepping in to stop the bullying of a pregnant woman, dozens of hands reached for their pockets. Within seconds, a forest of glass and metal rose, smartphones were out, lenses focused, recording every second of her humiliation for the digital world to consume. Julian's face shifted. The polished mask of the elite heir cracked, revealing a jagged, raw insecurity. He hated that she wasn't cowering. He hated that even in a cleaner's uniform, she looked down on him. "You think you have a choice?" Julian hissed. In a flash of pure, unbridled malice, Julian's polished Italian loafer shot out. It wasn't a trip, it was a violent, calculated kick aimed at her hip to send her back to the floor where he believed she belonged. The impact was sickening. Cassia's breath left her in a ragged sob as she was sent reeling. Her body collided with the sharp, unyielding corner of a heavy mahogany chair. The wood dug into her side, and for a terrifying second, the world went sideways. She hit the marble with a heavy thud, the contents of her mop bucket drenching her uniform in cold, dirty water. "Oops," Julian laughed, the sound echoing off the 40-foot ceilings. "I guess gravity is as unforgiving as I am." "Watch your step, Cassia. A woman in your condition should be more careful." Pain flared through Cassia's hip, radiating toward her spine. She lay there, gasping, her dark skin a stark contrast against the clinical white stone. She looked up at the circle of diners. Not one person moved to help. A woman in a silk dress adjusted her camera angle to get a better shot of the cleaner crying on the floor. "Please be okay. Please be okay," Cassia whispered to the life inside her. Her trembling fingers found the pear-cut diamond ring hidden beneath the wet fabric of her sleeve. This was the moment. The dragon didn't like to be summoned, but he liked his treasure being touched even less. With a final, defiant look at Julian, Cassia pressed the center stone of the ring. A silent, red pulse thrummed against her skin, a digital death warrant for everyone in the room who had chosen to watch instead of act. Julian leaned down, his shadow falling over her like a shroud. "Don't bother looking for help, Cassia. In this mall, I am the law. And you? You're just a ghost I'm finally exorcising." He didn't hear the mechanical grinding of the security shutters beginning to descend. He didn't see the staff at the entrance suddenly snapping to attention, their faces pale with terror. He was too busy laughing at the woman he thought he'd broken, unaware that the real monster was already in the elevator. The air in the Aurelian room didn't just turn cold. It became heavy, as if the oxygen itself had been replaced by a suffocating, metallic dread. Julian Vane was still mid-laugh, his expensive leather shoe resting mockingly near Cassia's damp shoulder, when the first mechanical groan vibrated through the floorboards. It was a sound that didn't belong in a 5-star restaurant, a deep, industrial grinding that drowned out the soft violin overhead. Suddenly, the massive floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the city were eclipsed. Heavy steel security shutters, reinforced with carbon fiber plating, began their slow, unstoppable descent. One by one, the views of the Seoul skyline vanished, replaced by a wall of cold, gray metal. The natural light died, and for 3 heart-stopping seconds, the room was plunged into total darkness before the amber emergency lights flickered to life. "What is this?" Julian's voice cracked, the arrogance finally leaking out of his tone. He spun around, looking for a manager, but the staff had already retreated to the perimeter, their faces as pale as ghosts. "Is there a fire? Open the doors." The crowd of diners, who seconds ago had been a forest of glass recording a woman's pain for likes, now felt the trap snap shut. The bystander apathy that had kept them rooted to their chairs was instantly replaced by bystander terror. They rushed toward the heavy oak entrance, only to find that the gold-plated handles wouldn't budge. The magnetic locks had engaged with the finality of a prison cell. "We're locked in," a woman screamed, her designer handbag falling to the floor, forgotten. "The signal is dead. I can't call out." It was true. The diamond pulse from Cassia's ring hadn't just alerted her husband, it had activated a localized jamming field. Every smartphone that had been used to film her humiliation was now nothing more than a useless slab of glass. Cassia remained on the floor, her hands still clutched over her 7-month-old son. She could feel the baby kicking, a frantic, rhythmic reminder of the life Julian had just endangered. But as she looked up through the amber gloom, she didn't see a victim in the mirror of the polished marble. She saw a predator's wife waiting for the alpha to arrive. Julian scrambled back toward his table, his eyes darting toward the vents, toward the kitchen, anywhere but the woman he had just kicked. This is a glitch. A security error. My father will have someone's head for this. But the dragon doesn't care about fathers or legacies. 3 floors up, the elevator didn't just move, it plummeted with purposeful speed. In the small, mirrored space, Quan Shinwu adjusted his cuffs. He didn't look angry. He looked like a man who had already calculated the exact cost of Julian Vane's life and found it to be worth less than the gray water soaking his wife's uniform. Back in the Aurelian room, the silence was more terrifying than the screaming. The diners had realized that the shutters weren't there to keep a threat out. They were there to keep everyone in. This was the second lesson of the underworld, the gilded cage. When a king's treasure is touched, the entire kingdom is held accountable until the debt is paid in full. A heavy, rhythmic thud echoed from the other side of the oak doors. Thump. 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 The sound of absolute confidence. The sound of a man who didn't need to hurry because his prey had nowhere left to run. Julian gripped the back of a mahogany chair, the same chair Cassia had been slammed into, his knuckles white, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He finally looked down at Cassia, seeing the pear-cut diamond glowing with a steady, vengeful red light on her finger. What are you?" he whispered, his voice trembling. Cassia didn't answer. She simply looked toward the doors as the magnetic locks hissed, releasing a cloud of pressurized air. The dragon had arrived. The magnetic locks on the primary entrance hissed, a sound like a predator exhaling, before the heavy oak doors swung inward. The Aurelian room was already a tomb of silence, but as Quan Shinwu stepped into the amber-lit atrium, the very molecules in the air seemed to crystallize. This was the second lesson of the underworld, nonverbal dominance. Shinwu didn't have to shout to be heard, his presence was a frequency that every animal in the room recognized as an apex threat. He moved with a slow, measured confidence, his bespoke charcoal suit catching the flickering emergency lights. Behind him, a phalanx of men in gray tactical suits moved like shadows, their eyes scanning the VIP tables with the cold efficiency of a firing squad. The crowd. The same people who had been laughing and recording Cassia's fall, instinctively recoiled. Bodies moved before minds could process why, a ripple of terror spreading through the elite diners as they backed away, tripping over their own luxury handbags and overturned chairs. It was like the Red Sea parting, a path opening through hundreds of people, all of them suddenly unable to meet the eyes of the man approaching. Shinwu didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at the shattered porcelain or the spilled wine. His gaze was a laser, locked entirely on the woman sitting in the gray mop water. Julian Vane stood frozen by table 12, his hands still gripping the mahogany chair. He tried to speak, to summon the ghost of his family's prestige, but his throat was as dry as ash. Who gave you permission to lock down my father's favorite restaurant?" Shinwu stopped 10 feet away. He didn't answer. He simply looked at Julian. A look so cold it felt like being touched by a blade. Then, the dragon did something that shattered the last of Julian's sanity. Quan Xinwu, the man who held the debt of half the city's corporations, knelt. He ignored the ruin of his $10,000 trousers as he sank into the dirty cleaning water beside Cassia. His large, scarred hand reached out, brushing a damp strand of hair from her forehead with a tenderness that was more terrifying than any threat. "Jajia," he whispered, his voice a low, vibrating hum that made the nearby silverware rattle. "Tell me. Did he touch you?" Cassia leaned into his palm, her breath hitching as the adrenaline finally began to fade into the safety of his presence. She looked at Julian, who was now trembling so violently his teeth were chattering. "He thought I was still his servant, Xinwu. He thought no one was watching." Xinwu's jaw tightened, a small muscle jumping in his cheek. The only sign of the hurricane brewing beneath the surface. He stood up slowly, his height looming over Julian like a shadow from which there was no escape. "Julian Vane," Xinwu said, his voice dropping another 10 degrees. "You once told my wife she belonged on the floor because she lacked a legacy. Now, I'm going to show you what happens when a legacy is deleted in real time." He didn't look back as his men stepped forward to surround Julian's table. "The Red Sea has parted, Mr. Vane," Xinwu continued, his eyes turning to the color of flint. "And now, the water is coming back for you." The air in the Aurelian room didn't just feel cold anymore, it felt hollow, as if the very foundation of Julian Vane's world had been scooped out. He stood paralyzed, his hands still white-knuckled on the back of the mahogany chair, while Quan Xinwu rose from the floor like a dark tide. I had no idea," Julian stammered, his voice jumping an octave. He looked at Cassia, then back at the towering man in the charcoal suit. "There's been a massive misunderstanding. She was a housekeeper. My family, the Vanes, we've been pillars of this city for 30 years. My father, your father," Xinwu interrupted, his voice a low, clinical hum that silenced the room, "is currently sitting in a boardroom 3 floors up, weeping. Do you know why, Julian?" Julian swallowed hard, the sweat now visible on his brow. "He's probably looking for me." "We have a gala to attend?" "No," Xinwu stepped closer, his presence radiating a predatory heat. "He's weeping because 10 minutes ago, he signed over 51% of Vane Enterprises to a shell company he didn't recognize. A company called the Silver Ring Holdings." Xinwu reached out and gently took Cassia's hand, lifting it so the pear-cut diamond caught the amber emergency lights. "Named after the very glass you mocked. You see, Julian, while you were busy playing the part of a prince, your father was drowning in gambling debts and bad real estate moves. I didn't just buy his debt. I bought his legacy." A collective gasp rippled through the diners. This was the third lesson of the underworld, the pedigree check. In the modern world, your name is only as strong as the credit limit behind it. Julian shook his head frantically. "That's impossible. We're protected. We have immunity." "You had protection," Xinwu corrected, pulling a sleek, black smartphone from his breast pocket. "But that protection was a contract. And a contract requires the safety of the lender's family. You kicked the woman who holds the pen to your father's life." Xinwu turned the screen toward Julian. It wasn't a text message or a photo. It was a real-time banking interface. "Look closely, Julian. This is your life in numbers." Xinwu's thumb hovered over the screen. "Director Han," he called out without looking back. "Sir," the lead man in the gray suit responded, stepping forward. "Protocol 7. Full spectrum. Let the room watch." Suddenly, the massive digital menus and art screens surrounding the restaurant flickered and changed. They didn't show food anymore. They showed a live feed of Julian Vane's personal assets. Account ending in 0042, $4,200,000, status, active. Xinwu tapped the screen once. The numbers began to tumble, spinning like a slot machine in reverse until they hit a staggering, hollow $0. Status, frozen. A woman in the crowd shrieked as Julian's fiancé's phone began to chime incessantly with transaction declined notifications. Julian watched, his mouth hanging open, as his entire identity was dismantled in front of the very people he had tried to impress. Your penthouse in Gangnam? Reclaimed, Shinwoo said, his thumb tapping again. Your fleet of Ferraris? Flagged for repossession. Your membership to every club in this city? Revoked. Julian collapsed into the mahogany chair, the same one he had kicked Cassia into. The irony wasn't lost on the crowd. The cameras were still rolling, but the story had changed. They weren't filming a cleaner anymore, they were filming the birth of a ghost. You're nothing now, Julian, Shinwoo whispered, leaning down until they were eye to eye. No money. No name. No exits. Now. Let's talk about the bruise on my wife's hip. The digital menus of the Aurelian room, once displaying vintage wines and Wagyu steaks, now flickered with the cold, blue light of Julian Vane's terminal collapse. The forest of glass, the smartphones of the elite, remained raised, but the fingers holding them were trembling. They weren't just recording a scandal, they were witnessing a digital execution. Check your phone, Julian, Shinwoo said, his voice as calm as a frozen lake. I want you to feel the moment your pulse leaves the system. Julian's pocket buzzed. Then it vibrated continuously, a frantic, rhythmic death rattle. With shaking hands, he pulled out his device. The notifications were a waterfall of red, account revoked. Access denied. Credit limit, $0. His face went from pale to a sickly, translucent white. My father's company, Julian whispered, his eyes darting to the screens. You can't just take it. There are laws. There are boards of directors. I am the board, Shinwoo countered. He turned his phone screen toward the room, activating a public broadcast that overrode every local network. Suddenly, every TV in the Starfield Mall, every tablet in the restaurant, and every phone in the crowd displayed a single, devastating document, the Vane Enterprises bankruptcy filing, signed and stamped in real time. But Shinwoo wasn't done. This was the fourth lesson of the underworld, the social erasure. Director Han, Shinwoo called out, his eyes never leaving Julian's. Release the Vane files. On the giant screens, the financial data vanished, replaced by something far more damaging. High-definition security footage began to play, not of the restaurant, but of Julian in private clubs, Julian laughing as he forged his father's signature, Julian mocking the very people sitting in this room during private recorded rants. The crowd gasped. The women Julian had flirted with recoiled. The business partners he had lied to stood up in outrage. Julian wasn't just broke, he was a pariah. You thought prestige was something you inherited, Shinwoo said, stepping so close that Julian could see the reflection of his own terror in the Mafia boss's eyes. But prestige is a shadow. And I just turned off the sun. Julian's fiancée finally stood up, her face twisted in disgust. She didn't look at him with pity, she looked at him as if he were a cockroach. She dropped her engagement ring into a glass of half-finished champagne and walked toward the exit, ignoring his frantic, silent plea for her to stay. Wait. No. This is a setup. Julian screamed, his voice cracking into a desperate sob. He looked at the crowd, the same people he had been performing for minutes ago. Help me. Someone call the police. He's kidnapping me. No one moved. The bystander apathy had returned, but this time, it was Julian's enemy. The elite diners looked at him with cold indifference. In their world, a man without a balance sheet didn't exist. Shinwoo turned back to Cassia, who was now standing, wrapped in his charcoal gray coat. The heavy wool covered her cleaner's uniform, effectively erasing the servant Julian had tried to humiliate. The debt is almost settled, Jajia, Shinwoo said, his voice dropping back into that silk-wrapped steel. But there is still the matter of the physical insult. How would you like him to pay for the kick? The room held its breath. The dragon was offering his queen the sword. The transition from the chaotic restaurant to the clinical silence of the fifth-floor medical suite was jarring. The air here didn't smell of expensive truffles or spilled gray water, it smelled of ozone and high-grade disinfectant. Kwon Shin-woo had carried Cassia himself, ignoring the elevators and taking the private service stairs with a speed that left his security detail breathless. He placed her on the examination table as if she were made of spun glass, his large, scarred hands trembling slightly as he pulled his charcoal coat tighter around her shoulders. Dr. Choi is the best in the country, Shin-woo whispered, his voice thick with a vulnerability he only showed to her. He is already here. You are safe. He is safe. The doors slid open, and an elderly man with sharp, intelligent eyes and a white coat entered, followed by two nurses wheeling a portable ultrasound machine. There were no questions about the shadow dragon being in a medical suite with a woman in a cleaner's uniform. In this mall, discretion was the only currency that mattered. Mrs. Kwon, the doctor bowed deeply. Let's see to our young prince. As the cold gel touched Cassia's stomach and the rhythmic, galloping sound of a fetal heartbeat filled the quiet room, the tension finally bled out of Shin-woo's shoulders. He closed his eyes for exactly 3 seconds. The nurses would later say it looked like he was praying, but Cassia knew better. He was recalibrating. He was deciding whether to remain the husband she loved or become the monster the world feared. The heartbeat is strong, Director, Dr. Choi announced, pointing to the flickering gray image on the screen. The kick was absorbed by the soft tissue of the hip. There is a hematoma forming, and she will need bed rest, but the placenta is intact. Your son is a fighter. Cassia reached out, her fingers lacing through Shin-woo's. You heard him, Shin-woo. We're okay. Shin-woo didn't look at the screen. He looked at the purple-black bruise already blooming on Cassia's dark skin, a jagged mark left by Julian Vane's arrogance. His eyes turned into 2 shards of black ice. The physical damage is minor, Shin-woo said, his voice dropping to a level that made the nurses instinctively step back. But the intent was absolute. He tried to break what is mine. Don't kill him, Cassia said softly, squeezing his hand. If you kill him, he becomes a martyr for his father's remaining allies. If you kill him, you're the man Julian said you were. Shin-woo leaned down, pressing his forehead against hers. Then what would you have me do with the ghost at table 12? Make him remember, Cassia whispered. Take away his voice. Take away his hands. Not with a blade, but with the truth. Ensure he can never look at another woman, another servant, and see anything but the man who lost everything because he couldn't control his own foot. Shin-woo nodded slowly. The decision was made. He stood up, the warmth of the husband vanishing as the shadow dragon took control. He turned to Director Han, who was standing at the door. Is the footage from the Aurelian room uploaded? To every major news network and social platform in Asia, sir, Han replied. The bystander apathy edit is trending. The world is currently watching Julian Vane beg for mercy in a room full of people who are ignoring him. His father has officially stepped down. Good, Shin-woo said. Bring him to the center atrium. I want him to see my wife one last time before he becomes a ghost. The center atrium of the Starfield Mall was no longer a place of commerce, it had become a cathedral of judgment. Under the glow of the 40-foot crystal chandeliers, a massive circle had formed. Hundreds of shoppers and elite diners stood perfectly still, their faces illuminated by the blue light of the giant digital pillars that lined the hall. In the very center, Julian Vane was on his knees. He was no longer the prince of industry. His $5,000 blazer was torn, his silk tie discarded, and his face was a map of raw, unfiltered terror. He looked at the crowd, pleading for a single friendly face, but he found only a forest of glass. Every person who had once climbed over themselves to be seen with him was now filming his demise, their silence a deafening roar of bystander apathy turned against its creator. The glass elevator descended slowly, a silent bird of prey. When the doors slid open, Kwon Shin-woo stepped out first, but he didn't lead. He reached back, taking Cassia's hand and guiding her onto the marble floor. She had shed the cleaner's smock. Wrapped in Shin-woo's charcoal black overcoat, her dark skin glowing under the warm lights, she looked every bit the queen of the Shadow Dragon Syndicate. The pear-cut diamond on her finger caught the light, flashing a steady, rhythmic pulse that seemed to beat in time with the silence of them all. As they approached, Julian let out a broken, pathetic sob. "Cassia, please. I was wrong. I was stressed, the business, the debts." "I didn't mean to, you meant every bit of it, Julian," Cassia said, her voice calm and echoing through the 40-foot ceilings. She stood over him, not with malice, but with a weary, regal pity. "You didn't just kick a woman. You kicked someone you thought couldn't fight back. That is the definition of a coward." Shin-woo stepped forward, his shadow swallowing Julian whole. "The world has seen the footage, Julian. They've seen you assault a pregnant woman. They've seen your father's bankruptcy. By tomorrow morning, the name Vane will be a synonym for trash in every boardroom from Seoul to New York." "Please," Julian whispered, clutching at the air. "Don't send me to prison. I won't survive." "Prison?" Shin-woo tilted his head, a sharp, predatory smile touching his lips. "That's too easy. You'll be processed by the authorities for the assault, yes. But your real sentence is the one I've already passed. You are now a nobody. You have no money, no home, and no one to call. You will walk out of these doors and realize that the world you mocked is the only one you have left. And they will treat you exactly how you treated Cassia." Shin-woo turned to Director Han. "Escort Mr. Vane to the service exit. The one the cleaners use. He should get used to that door." As Julian was dragged away, screaming into the indifferent silence of the crowd, Shin-woo turned back to Cassia. He placed a hand gently on her 7-month-old belly, his eyes softening for the first time since the alarm had triggered. "Are you ready to go home, my queen?" Cassia looked at the crowd, the people who had watched, the people who had filmed, and the people who were now bowing as she passed. She realized that power wasn't just about the husband standing beside her. It was about the strength she had found while she was on the floor. "Yes," Cassia said, her voice firm and full of the future. "But first, tell Director Han to give every member of the cleaning staff a 500% bonus. And tell them, the next person who sees someone fall and doesn't reach out a hand is fired." Shin-woo nodded, a look of pure pride in his eyes. He leaned down and kissed her forehead before leading her toward the private exit. The dragon and his queen walked out of the Starfield Mall, leaving behind a shattered legacy and a crowd that finally understood the ultimate lesson. True power doesn't need a pedestal, it just needs a reason to stand up.